Well, good morning, everybody, and good to be back with you again. Just before we dive into evil and Satan, wanted to express my gratitude once again to Drake and to Mary D. It's always wonderful to be, and to Brick and everybody at FPC. It's always great to be back at the Covenant class. I look forward to it every February, and always know there's going to be lively discussion. And in the midst of basketball season, we dive deep into the Bible and theology. And I know I say this most times I'm up here, but just grateful for the leadership at First Presbyterian from top to bottom. You have such a wonderful pastoral and church staff. Drake just mentioned RISC. The seminary has gotten really involved in RISC as well, and our students and some of our staff members have worked really closely with Amy, who has been, and Derek, but Amy has just been such an incredible mentor and advocate for RISC, and there have been a number of partnerships between the seminary and FPC in that regard, so grateful for that. As is evident whenever I speak of your pastoral staff, I think they hung the moon. So anyway, that is not what we're here to talk about. We're here to talk about the devil. So one of the things that I want to sort of, as we frame this issue, I guess I want to start by saying we don't talk about the devil very much in the PCUSA. Some of you may have grown up in other traditions. We certainly have friends or relatives who did, and in a lot of other churches and a lot of other denominational and Christian strands, you hear a great deal more about evil and the devil and the havoc that the devil can wreak in your life and the need to stay away from the devil and all those kinds of things. And that can be a very powerful message. I joke sometimes that we had a Presbytery meeting, and I was joking that, in some of the more evangelical churches, the mantra is, well, you need to come to church and you need to do what the pastor says so that you will avoid hell and the devil. In the PCUSA, well, come to church because you need to serve Jesus and it's all complicated. It's a more complicated message than the former one. So, but we want to get, as I'm now going to do exactly true to form, I'm now going to make it very complicated. And what I'm going to do is show who is this figure we talk about, and where does whatever it is, show up in the Bible? What's the earliest evidence for it? How does it develop? And to what extent should we continue to, or start to maintain a belief in some sort of external supernatural power that's wreaking havoc on us in the universe? So the other thing I would say, and I will next week, I don't want to today because I don't want to muddy the waters, it does bear stating that the devil, Satan, whatever we consider to be the demonic force in the universe, if we believe in such a thing, our conception of that is going to owe far more to post-biblical literature than what we find in the Bible. No matter what we think, that is influencing us a great deal. What I mean by that is movies you have seen about the devil, John Milton's Paradise Lost, Dante's Inferno, all the art and interpretations that go with those post-biblical understandings, those have influenced Christian conceptions of the devil every bit as much, if not more so, than the Bible. And we don't fully acknowledge as often as we might the extent to which our perceptions on who God is, what evil is, and just some core theological fundamental issues owe to things that are outside the Bible. And that's okay, but we have to acknowledge it. Make sense? Okay. But today I'm going to focus on some texts and passages, and then we'll talk about them. All right. First of all, we have about 3 or 4 references in the Old Testament to Satan, or Ha-Satan, and I'll explain what I mean by that. All right, first of all, in the prologue to Job, one day the heavenly beings, so there's angels in the universe. There are angels who wait upon God. In Genesis 1, at the very beginning of the Bible, what does God say in Genesis 1:26? Let us make humanity in our own image. And the question is, who's God talking to? God seems to have a heavenly court of angels who help God in the creative process, who are ultimately subservient to God, but who help God. If you read through the book of Genesis, you will remember angels come down and mess with Abraham, Jacob. God has attendants. So similarly, in the book of Job, God sits in a heavenly courtroom and has attendants, has heavenly beings who wait on God and who can converse with God in a courtroom, throne room situation. One day, the heavenly beings came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came among them. The Lord said to Satan, or the adversary, "Where have you come from?" Satan answered the Lord, "From going to and from the earth, walking up and down it." The Lord said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job? There's no one like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil." Then Satan answered the Lord, Does Job fear God for nothing? Have you not put a fence around him and his house and all that he has on every side? You have blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land. Stretch out your hand now and touch all that he has, and he will curse you to your face. The Lord said to Satan, "Very well, all that he has is in your power. Only do not stretch out your hand against him." So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord. So the question here is, I didn't even change the slide, did I? Somebody should have said something. Come on. There we go. No, it's changing on mine, but not yours. All right, let's disconnect and try again. We may need brick. Now I don't have it over here. But I can't advance the slides. Yeah, I'm going to need brick. Let's see, does that do it? Matt, no, maybe I'm okay, Drake. Hang on. Sorry. But we're not going to get anywhere if I can't, because this is complicated stuff. Yeah, that's right. I would agree with that. Well, let me, I'll keep talking because I don't want to run out of time. So I just read very quickly through the prologue to Job. So you have this figure in Job 1 who says, well, you have this righteous servant Job who is blameless, upright, honest, and God says, I mean, that's what God says to this figure, and the adversary, the Satan figure, responds, well, that's because he hasn't experienced any adversity. So if you afflict him with troubles, if you create enmity, if you create fracture in his life, he will then curse you and fall from his waywardness. So you do have here a sense of, you have this adversary figure who is stirring up trouble. He is he's a sort of a roving, sometimes I call him a roving prosecuting attorney, but he is a troubling figure who sits in God's court, who sort of serves as a tester as to whether Job will remain faithful. And we're not here so much to go into the story of Job and what it means. We did some of that last week. It's not working. Yeah, thanks. So yeah, the mirroring thing, I was getting that orange screen again, and so it won't advance. Like it won't advance to my slide. I've unplugged it once. There we go. What did you do?
I just
Okay.
started the slideshow on a presenter view,
Okay.
so you get to look at the...
Let's make sure it's working. All right, we're good. Thank you, Brick.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. I think the point in the back was the best, that the devil is in the technology. Yeah, absolutely. All right, so I don't know that I would. This is getting into the weeds a little bit. In some of the cases, in some of the Hebrew, the way Hebrew express, how if we are going to attach a definite article to something, we use the word the. We would say the accuser. I would probably translate this as the adversary rather than Satan. But the question is, do you want to use the proper name? In some cases in the Old Testament, you just have Satan. In some cases, you have Ha-Satan, the Satan, the adversary. It just depends on the passage. It only shows up a handful of times. But it does seem the case that this seems to be some sort of troublemaker in God's heavenly court whose goal, somewhat accepted by God, is to create tests and trials, and in some cases torments, to determine if human beings are going to listen. Another one would be here, without the definite article, I would translate it Satan here. Satan stood up against Israel and incited David to count the people of Israel. So this is just some passing verse in Chronicles that you've probably never seen before, but Satan orders David to conduct a census. David's been a kind of a king. There's been some sin in the land. There's been some idolatry. There's been some misbehavior. God wants David to figure out how many people are in the various kingdoms and asks David to do that. Now, David agrees to do so, but what I want to draw your attention to is the fact that the Satan figure in Chronicles is quite similar to the angel, and this is a passage you may or may not have looked at, who comes to test and engage Balaam in the story with Balaam's ass in Numbers. So in other words, God has angels of destruction who come to test and or engage with human beings. And the Satan figure seems to be one of those angels of destruction. The Lord opened the eyes of Balaam. He saw the angel of the Lord standing in the road with his drawn sword in his hand, and he bowed down, falling on his face. The angel of the Lord said to him, "Why have you struck your donkey these 3 times? I have come out as an adversary because your way is perverse before me." So Balaam's not really being, this is a funny story. The donkey starts talking, and it's meant to be somewhat humorous, but you do have this angelic figure who has an adversarial role. I've come against you as an adversary. So looking back to the Chronicles passage, David looked up and saw the angel of the Lord standing between earth and heaven, and in his hand a drawn sword stretched out over Jerusalem. David and the elders, clothed in sackcloth, fell on their faces. Very similar passages. In both cases, the accuser figure is acting as a quote-unquote angel of destruction, who seems to be in God's employ, seems to be in heaven, but also has a mind of his own and a penchant for testing human beings, for tormenting them in some cases, but in every case being their adversary, being their opponent, being their antagonist as a way of testing, refining, keeping them from sin, and also seeing if they're going to remain faithful. All right, so who is this Ha-Satan? Who is this figure in the Old Testament? There have been 3 basic theses about it, and I've already tipped my hand as to which one I think is correct. Is he an earthly military opponent? Almost certainly not. In all these passages I've shown, he's up in the heavenly court with God. He's some sort of angelic being. He's not a human. A legal accuser in God's court. Last week, are there any lawyers here today? Last week there weren't any. So this is 2 weeks in a row with no lawyers. For years the idea was that he was kind of a district attorney stirring up trouble. That he was maybe just the lawyers are not raising their hands. I don't blame him. But that he was a roving district attorney, a roving prosecuting person, because Job is in many respects a courtroom scene. There's probably some truth to that, but not entirely accurate. The best idea would be that he is a heavenly attacker, in some cases doing God's bidding, in other cases seems to be more of a free agent who's dialoguing with God, as we find in the book of Job. So there seems to be an angelic, heavenly attacker or accuser who shows up a few scattered times, most famously in Job, in the Old Testament. Okay? So that's cryptic and again sparse, but very present and consistent with what we're going to see in some of the later texts, including the Old Testament texts. All right. Any questions so far about those passages? Objections? Yeah. Correct. I want to be like, that's exactly what it is. I mean, when I was first studying Job and dealing with this in the 90s, I wrote or suggested that that the closest it would come to, and this was in the midst of all that, would be Ken Starr, if you remember him, or Archibald Cox, whatever your politics are, an independent counsel who sort of gets a room and the ability to go study things for months and find out everything they can. That would be a closer analogy. It's not so much a DA. I think that's an excellent point. Way to correct me. So there is, and there's plenty of scenes in Job which seem to be like a courtroom. That the Satan figure accuses Job, and Job stands up and says, "I know my Redeemer lives." What Job wants is an attorney to stand up and take his defense in the heavenly court. But it's not just that the Satan figure is a special prosecutor, special counsel. He's also a heavenly attacker, an angel of destruction. Now, of course, the theological question here is a complicated one, and that is, why would God want and or allow such a figure to emerge? Why would this be necessary if we're dealing with a transcendent, all-powerful, gracious Creator God? I don't have an answer to that. It's similar to the answer as to where does evil come from. The idea is that this is necessary. I think the idea is that this is necessary to help explain the relationship between human agency, human sin, perhaps why certain bad things are allowed to happen. It's not an entirely helpful explanation, and it's important to note that this figure is not the devil. This figure is not the horned figure who is in some other nether region and is an opponent of God. This person can be an interlocutor with God, can be someone who's having conversations with God, but this is not Diabolos. This is not Satan the way Satan has been classically understood in Western culture as a pitchfork figure in the nether regions whose arch enemy is God. This is a heavenly being. It may be, in some cases, who is in league with God, in some cases seems to be a conversation partner with God, but is not God's enemy per se. Make sense? All right. That's an important thing to note, I would say. All right. So now we're going to move forward a little bit, and we're going to look at what we call some extra-canonical, intertestamental, non-biblical literature, much of which sits between the Old Testament and the New Testament. And a lot of it is really important for understanding what we find in the New Testament. So we're going to look at some of that. So some of the material that shows up is, there's just some of the titles that showed up. Mastema, in a text called Jubilees, which was written 3rd, 2nd century BCE, and it's a rewriting of the early Genesis stories and an exposition of the Genesis stories, where there's more stories involving Noah, Abraham, and they're really interesting. and were important to Jews during this period. There's multiple references, including one that I put on this PowerPoint to the Prince of Mastema, who seems to be some sort of heavenly figure analogous to the Satan figure in Job and Chronicles. Some sort of figure, and this figure has demons who report to him. Lower heavenly beings who wreak havoc, engage, and help this figure in testing. There's the figure of Belial, who shows up in the Dead Sea Scrolls. This person, it can also refer to, it's used a couple times in the Bible to refer to wicked persons who are part of the lot of Belial, somewhat of a synonym for Satan. You have references to evil spirits, and you have references to demons, most often whom are subordinate to Mastema. So just one passage in this regard from Jubilees. This is during the flood story when Noah's trying to figure out what's going on. If you remember, God decides, why does God send the flood in Genesis 6? Because the spirits of humanity are so wicked that God has to say, I've got to start over. I have to flood the earth and start over. So Jubilees is, and so that's a really problematic, that's a problematic story. I stand up sometimes and say, First Presbyterian Church, Richmond, my daughter was in kindergarten. I don't like it that that's the first story we expose our kids to. I think it's really problematic. I remember when she was doing that across the hall, and one kid raised their hand and said, why would God do that to all the children? And it's a fair question. Just because there's rainbows and the animals go in by twosies, that's why we do it, but it's a mistake because it's a very, very difficult story theologically. And you can't unring that bell when you teach it to kids when they're 5 and 6. So that's my adult Christian education protest for the day. And it happens everywhere, not just at First. So I'm being recorded. When Mastema, the leader of the spirits, came, he said, Lord, Creator, leave some of them before me. Let them listen to me and do everything I tell them, because if none of them is left for me, I shall not be able to exercise the authority of my will among mankind, for they are meant for the purpose of destroying and misleading before my punishment, because of the evil of humanity is great. So Noah is interacting with Mastema, and he's saying, they're trying to figure out, is all of humanity going to be destroyed? Are there the demons going to help in this regard? Noah protests a bit. There's some back and forth. A few chapters later, Abraham does something similar. He is tested in this regard. I didn't put that on the slide. So Abraham is tested, similar to what happens with the binding of Isaac story. It has to do with Hagar and Ishmael. I'm not going to go into that story, but just to say, this Mastema figure is similar to the character in Job. He's an angel of destruction, but he also comes down to see who's going to be faithful and who needs to be destroyed. So you have here, continuous with what we saw in the Old Testament, God seems to have angels of destruction who are trying to determine sinfulness, punishment, and what needs to happen to human beings. Their encounters are primarily with human beings, not with the rest of creation. Anybody have any questions about any of that? Comments? I know that this is really light stuff for Lent, isn't it? We're going to talk next week about what all this means, but I can't talk about what it means until I get it on the table. All right. Now, there are some texts that sort of steer away from what we call angelology that would say, so there's not the Bible, then this is in the Catholic canon. I put this text up last week. The Bible doesn't uniformly, and the early Christian and Jewish texts, they don't uniformly engage in highlighting the Satan figure. Here's a good example. This is from the Wisdom of Solomon. Don't invite death by the error of your life or bring on destruction by the work of your hands, because God did not make death, and he does not delight in the death of the living. For he created all things so that they might exist. The generative forces of the world are wholesome. So this author is aware of traditions such as we find here and wants to push back against them and to sort of say, the generative forces of the world are wholesome, there's no destructive poison in them, and the dominion of Hades is not on earth. For righteousness is immortal, but the ungodly by their words and deeds summon death. Considering him a friend, they pined away and made a covenant with him, because they are fit to belong to his company. This would suggest that death, sin, destruction are instantiated, are created, are in a sense made by human sinfulness. That we create evil by ignoring God, acting in immoral and dissolute ways, and therefore inviting and in a sense conjuring death. And therefore there's no external demonic force the way some of these other texts are describing. It is all a function of human sinfulness. Now, the response to that would be, well, who put the urge to sin, implanted that into human beings? That's the $64,000 question. But this is a way of sort of saying, hey, and we looked at a passage last week in that regard too that said, don't say God caused me to sin, for God doesn't do what God hates. So here is very similar from the Wisdom of Solomon, first century, around the time of the turn of the era, roughly for about the time that Jesus would have been born. This was written in Egypt by a believing Jew who was also influenced by Stoicism and by Platonism, especially Platonism, by Plato's ideas about the immortality of the soul. Similarly, and I'm going to look at one New Testament passage, no one, and this shows you the diversity of beliefs during this period and the fact that there's no one position. And I know I'm throwing a lot at you, but here's from the New Testament, similar to the Wisdom of Solomon. No one, when tempted, should say, I'm being tempted by God, for God cannot be tempted by evil, and he himself tempts no one. But one is tempted by one's own desire, being lured and enticed by it. Then when that desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and that sin, when it is fully grown, gives birth to death. Do not be deceived, my beloved. So exactly what we find in Wisdom of Solomon. You, us, all of us, if we engage in sinfulness, if we allow it to fester, if we allow temptation, if we give into temptation by our desire, that will give birth. It will give birth to sin, and sin gives birth to death. Death being living apart from God, not living in communion with God, and living according to one's desire and lusts. So that's what we find in James, which is quite similar to what we see in the Wisdom of Solomon. Those two texts would want to resist a sort of understanding of the universe and of the heavenly abode, just who resides in the heavens, that would involve any type of angel of destruction. Everybody still with me? Yeah. That's a really good question. In the text we've looked at so far, Satan seems to be an external force. Seems to be an external force who has some agency, sometimes checks with God and says, can I go do this? In some of the later texts, seems to be more of a free agent. Here, evil seems to be internal and something that you create when you decide to give yourself over to sin. So it depends on the text, and it depends on the understanding. In these earlier texts, the Satan figure is certainly external, but can create internal conflict because he comes down, he's external, but then he comes down to mess with human beings to try to get them to sin internally. And we're going to look at a couple of passages in that regard. So some cases external, some cases internal, some cases a combination. Good question. All right, so now I want to look at a couple of passages from the Dead Sea Scrolls, and I don't want to run out of time. I can go till 10:15? Okay, all right. I thank you, Lord. I'm going to go a little quickly through these because I know y'all want to talk about the New Testament. I thank you because you have saved my life from the pit and from Sheol and Abad, and you have lifted me to an everlasting height so that I can walk on a boundless plain. And I know there's hope for someone you fashioned out of clay for an everlasting community. The corrupt spirit you have purified from the great sin so that he can take his place in the host of the holy ones and can enter into community with the congregations of the sons of heaven. All right, this is very dualistic language. This is from the Dead Sea Scrolls. This is a believing Jewish community, 1st century BCE, 1st century CE, roughly contemporaneous, a little earlier than the Jesus movement. They believe in eternal life, just like the first Jesus followers do, and they have an understanding of light and darkness, which is similar to what we find in John. In fact, I think the Gospel of John is dependent on that understanding, and they believe humanity and the universe is divided into the sons of light and the sons of darkness. And to your question, there's heavenly angels of destruction, there's heavenly angels of light, just as there's a battle going on in each of our souls between light and darkness. And those two things parallel each other. So the answer to this question is external and internal. Let's look at a couple of other passages. The nature of the children of men is ruled by two spirits. And during their life, all the hosts of men have a portion of their divisions and walk in both their ways. And the reward of their deeds shall be for everlasting ages, according to whether each man's portion in their divisions is great and small. That's very complicated language. Let me simplify it and say there's two spirits. There's the spirit of Belial. Belial is mentioned in this passage. The demon is mentioned in this passage. And then the spirit of light. Remember, what do we say? What do we read in John 1? The light shines in the darkness, but the darkness won't overcome it. That whole light-darkness duality owes to this material from the Dead Sea Scrolls. I can show you how the author of John 1 used this language that we read at Christmas time. Now, what's happening is, to come back to your question, as this heavenly battle's going on, each of us has decisions to make. We have temptations, we have inclinations, and it's up to us to walk in the ways of the spirit of light, the spirit of truth, and to walk away from Belial and the lot of the sons of darkness. It's very eschatological, meaning that there's a belief in heaven, and it's very dualistic, light, darkness, good, evil, and very ethically framed. So if you are in the good, as for the visitation, visitation means judgment or punishment or reckoning. You could translate, as for the judgment or reckoning for all who walk in this spirit, it will be for, meaning light, it will be for healing, great peace, and a long life, fruitfulness, together with every everlasting blessing, and eternal joy, and life without end, a crown of glory, and garment of majesty, and unending light. So if you walk in the ways of the spirit of truth and righteousness, you will then attain eternal life with the garment of majesty and a crown of glory. Now, this is one of the more colorful descriptions in any text of what happens if you go to the other direction. This one is something else. This destiny for the ones who are in the sons of darkness, who follow Belial, the demonic path, will be for a glut of punishments at, notice here, the hands of all the angels of destruction. Same thing we found in earlier text. For eternal damnation, for the scorching wrath of the God of revenge, for permanent error and shame without end, with the humiliation of destruction by the fire of the dark regions. And all the ages of their generations they shall spend in bitter weeping and harsh evils in the abysses of darkness until their destruction, without there being a remnant or a survivor among them. That's heavy. That's like, fiery punishment for those who, at the hands of all the angels of destruction. And lest we think, okay, this is pretty rough stuff, this is very similar to what we find in the book of Revelation with the sulfur lake and the punishments that people will find. In Luke 16, remember the rich man and Lazarus. The rich man is down in a similar, it has a similar fate with deep pain, fiery judgment, and in a region from which he cannot return. So we do find this in the New Testament as well. So this comes at your question. We have these angels of destruction in the text, and this is very, very similar to what we find in the New Testament. All of this is from, and by the way, that picture was taken, that is Qumran. I took that picture. That is the cave where these texts were found at Qumran, which is is on the road from Jericho to Masada in the West Bank in Israel. All right. Okay. Now we're going to talk about the New Testament. And we will see how, here's what, the one thing I will say is all the text and stuff I've shown you to this point is essential background for understanding who the figure is in the New Testament. This is part of the same Jewish tradition. These passages in the New Testament are you can draw a line from what we've seen with these heavenly accuser, executioner, troublemaking figures and what we find in the New Testament. Here are some of the terms that are used. The Satan is the thing we find in Mark and in Matthew, the adversary or the devil, diabolos, the evil one, the tester or the tempter, Beelzebul, the lord of the temple or dwelling, Beliar, which is a derivation of Belial. So here are some of our terms in the New Testament. Now, what does this figure do? And we'll look at a couple of passages. All right, so we just had Ash Wednesday, in which, and let's just look at. I'll go to the next slide. He's a tempter or a tester. It's appropriate to look at this passage. I just looked at one of the temptation scenes. Again, the devil. This is very Jobin, very similar to the figure in Job. The accuser, the punisher, the devil took him to a very high mountain. It is Diabolos there, but he's functioning very much like the Satan in Job and in Chronicles. Took him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their splendor. And he said to them, "All these I will give to you if you will fall down and worship me." Jesus said to him, "Away with you, Satan, for it is written, worship the Lord your God and only serve him." Then the devil left him, and suddenly angels came and waited on him. All right, let's spend a couple of minutes on this. We've gone so fast today. What do you see in this passage? First of all, Jesus is being tested. What else do you see? He's off alone in the wilderness. He's left. This is his sort of first act to determine faithfulness before he's going to go begin his public ministry. What else is going on here? Good thing to talk about during Lent, during these 40 days. He's fasting, yes. What about the conversation is happening? Just on a surface level. What's going on? What is the nature of the exchange? He's being tempted. And what is the diabolos, what does the devil want him to do? Bow down. Why is that problematic? Why don't you do that? Jesus tells us. This is not a trick question. It's the commandment. Yes, it's the commandment. Where do we find that commandment? The OT. But where? What is it? It's one of the what? 10 Commandments. Exactly. It is the idolatry commandment. And it's the first 3 commandments all to relate to worship and idolatry. Worship the Lord your God. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind. Don't bow down to, I'm the Lord your God, you shall have no other gods before me. And then don't have any idols. So the Satan figure is trying to determine whether Jesus will adhere to that and is offering him the whole world. And this is obviously a very helpful passage for us as we face earthly temptations of all sorts and idols that take us away from God. But in the context of this, we want to think about who is this devil figure? What is he doing? He is tempting. He is stirring up trouble. He is trying to steer Jesus from obeying the 10 Commandments, from obeying the Decalogue. He's trying to keep Jesus or take Jesus away from the tradition to which he has been taught and worship of the Lord alone. So what is his role? His role is to cause trouble, to tempt. We could translate that accuse, but his goal is to try to steer Jesus from the straight and narrow, but he's doing so in a way that is very similar to the other passages we've looked at. In Numbers, in Job, in Chronicles, in Jubilees, in all of the texts we looked at, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, that there are forces in the universe who are seeking to take us from the straight and narrow. They're external forces, and that they are the goal here is to see if Jesus is going to hold true to the covenant and to the Torah. Now, the one question we can ask here is who decided to send the Satan figure to go do that? Was he operating on his own agency, or did God send him in the manner that God allowed that to happen in Job? That's not really told to us. It's not really told to us. We're not privy to the conversations. One could assume that that's not really in the gospel writer's intention because Jesus is seen as the Messiah, the chosen one, God's Son, and that this figure is operating more as a free agent, right? But it's still too early to say that this person is the arch enemy and an opponent of God who has the realm that we might refer to as hell. That's not what's going on here. This figure is still operating in the same way that he did in some of the earlier texts. Does that make sense? Like, we're not to the point yet. In other words, all the assumptions we often have about who the diabolos, who the devil is, are perhaps overdrawn and more dependent on literature that is in some cases thousands of years, more than 1,000 years later than what we find in the Bible. This figure is more of a troublemaking angel than it is a full-fledged devil with a pitchfork who has an entirely different kingdom and who's the arch enemy of God. This is more of an angelic figure. He's a troubling angel. He's an angel of destruction, but that's sort of where he lies in this sort of framework. Make sense? Yes.
Could it be that just a way of showing the Christ is indeed demonized and
Oh, I think so. Absolutely. Absolutely. No, I think that is exactly what's going on. And is faced with the most, and is offered everything, and is shown to be a fallible human, well, an infallible human, but a human who was capable of sinning but chose not to. Made a conscious decision not to do so. Oh, that's a really good point. I guess that is another aspect of this text that is so important. I guess one of the things I was just focusing on here is what is the Satan figure trying to do here? Jesus' response is also really important, but who is the Satan figure and what's he trying to do? All right, the second thing that the figure does in the New Testament is lure the unsuspecting into an error. That in the parable of the sower, like just someone who, that there's a force in the world that tries to take us from the straight and narrow. There are the ones on the path where the word is sown. When they hear, Satan immediately comes and takes away the word that is sown in them. This is similar to in several times when Jesus is talking to Peter and Peter says, "Get behind me, Satan." You know those passages. The idea is that there's always something, someone, some sort of force that's trying to lure us from the path we should be taking. And that shows up a few times in the New Testament as well. The other thing that Satan is associated with is just a wide range of sins, especially those that violate the Torah. And here's a good passage. Satan is associated with idolatry, with worshiping other gods. Similarly, in Paul and in James, Satan is associated with pride, covetousness, what James calls friendship with the world. Anything that would draw you away from God's path is what Satan is associated with. Finally, Satan can be simply an attacker, an afflicter, the way Satan is in some of those earlier passages we saw in the Old Testament. Here's a good passage. This relates to sexual immorality. When you are assembled, somebody who's being licentious. When you are assembled and my spirit is present with the power of our Lord Jesus, you are to hand this man over to Satan for the destruction of the flesh, so that his spirit may be saved in the day of the Lord. So this seems to be some sort of public tribunal, and the man is brought before believers in Jesus, and you say, okay, he's committed sin, he's asking for forgiveness, Jesus is going to offer it, and his spirit is going to be renewed for service to Jesus Christ. But the point here is that there is an association of Satan as someone who attacks and afflicts people with sin, and in order to purge them, you have to be willing to say that you did wrong, and then God will cleanse you through Jesus Christ by the power of our Lord Jesus. But you see several times in Paul, seems to be Paul is associating Satan with being an attacker and afflictor who you have to avoid in order to remain connected to Christ. All right. This was a very technical day, but we do have a couple of minutes, and I want to open it up. And I can keep talking, but I want to open it up and just sort of say, okay, let's go in any direction with this. Like what you think about the devil, because hopefully I've tried a little bit to show that a couple of things. One is the Bible and related texts are by no means uniform on this question. There are diverse presentations and diverse understandings of what this figure means and who he is. The second thing is, for most of these texts, this figure seems to be, if not in the employment of God, doing so with God's consent, in conversation with God, or in some cases kind of as an external force, but sort of testing humanity, testing human beings to see if they're going to respond faithfully. Now, for me, the biggest question is, okay, and I'm going to talk next week about hell and whether we believe in that and how that relates to the present day and all those kinds of things. But let's stay on the devil for now. But the question then, my big question, and the one that I ask, and you may have similar ones, is, why would this be necessary in a universe where we maintain our faith in God, the creator of heaven and earth, who made Jesus Christ? And how is it possible that God would let this figure enter into the world? What is the reason for that? And or is the presence of this figure in those texts a way of reckoning with the presence of evil in the world? In other words, is this a way of seeking to explain why we have, in some cases, where all of us have, a penchant for engaging in evil or malicious acts? Is it a way of just wrestling with and explaining that? And the other question to ask, and I'm just trying to prod y'all to ask whatever you want, maybe there is some sort of external figure in the world who's causing up trouble. I mean, plenty of Christians believe in that, and there's plenty of, I guess we could say there's plenty of evidence, not evidence, there's plenty of examples of that in the biblical texts. So I asked last week for people to raise their hand and say, do you believe in the devil? Some people raised their hand, and the one thing I can say is there's a number of passages that suggest that there's a troublemaker figure who comes down and tries to steer us off the path. So all these things circle around in my mind as I think about human sin. It's a good thing to think about during Lent, but I will now open it up for any kinds of questions or conversation.
Wondering if the gospel writers were using the term Satan as a figure to help with the storytelling.
Yeah.
And it's not, that Satan is not meant as a figure or a person.
It's a good question.
It seems to me that this helps with the storytelling and how it helps humans understand.
It's a really good question. It's a question of whether we think, and what complicates Drake's question is if you look at the various terms, sometimes it's just a nameless figure, the adversary, the devil, the evil one, the tester or tempter. Sometimes it's Satan, sometimes it's Beelzebul. So there's not a straight answer to that. Sometimes it just seems to be a type, a nameless force or figure without a proper name. And in other cases, you do get Satanos, the proper name Satan in Greek. So it varies, Drake, but it's a good question, and it's unclear. Well, it does seem to be the case in the Gospels, for example, when Jesus is tempted. It does seem to believe that the Gospel writer has a belief that when Jesus retreats into the wilderness, he is met by a demonic/angelic figure who's seeking to tempt him in order to prove to the question back, the point back there, whether he's going to remain faithful to God. He certainly passes that test as he fasts. And then, as we saw in this passage, The angels, once he passes, the angels come and wait on him. This is very similar to what we saw in the Dead Sea Scrolls, where you got the angels of light and darkness and the angels of destruction. It seems that the authors of the Gospels believed in that, but the question that you raise is a good one. To what extent is this Satan figure in the Gospels a personified demon of sorts? And the answer to that is most unclear. He could just be a nameless angel of destruction, and he's never described. I mean, we don't get a description of what he looks like with the horns and the pitchfork. There's never any of that in the New Testament. So we don't know what he looks like, but he does sometimes personified, sometimes seems to be more of a type. Is that getting at your question a little bit? Yeah.
I think it's kind of, for me, I have trouble with when I was trying to think about evil and all that, trying to put like Satan in picture.
Yes, I do too.
I struggle with that more than the evil is not, there is no real figure of Satan.
Yeah. And I guess the thing that I would say, and for the most part in the New Testament, especially in the Gospels and in James, the Satan figure, his primary job, and arguably his only job, is to see if humans are going to remain faithful. He represents the temptations that each of us face in our own hearts and our own minds. He's a litmus test for whether Jesus and people are going to maintain their ties to God, and whether they're going to worship other idols, commit adultery, whatever they're going to do. He represents the lure of that, I guess you could say, more than he is an external demon of some sort. But you do have, I mean, the flip side to that is, in the Old Testament passages and sometimes in the New Testament, he seems to be this angel of destruction. He seems to be, that it seems that God has in God's heavenly court, a troublemaking figure, a special counsel, whose goal is to stir up trouble. So there's that as well. Other questions? Yes. No. That's a. I mean, I hate to be so. There is a figure who is an antagonist and a sort of a demonic figure in Revelation, and you do get some of that in early Christian literature. This figure is not an antichrist. You have to draw. That is a later interpretive leap. He is an angelic figure of destruction who is in the employ of God, and there's no indication in any of these early Jewish texts or Old Testament texts that he is seen as the opponent of Jesus. We can't do that until the Jesus traditions are developed enough in Revelation or afterwards for that to be the case. You can make that move a bit in Revelation, but not in any of these texts. I would not refer to him as an antichrist. I would refer to him as an accuser. I want to stick with the terms that are actually used in the New Testament. It is a later move that is made, but not yet. Not yet. So it's a good question, but I want to stick with the terms that are actually appearing in the New Testament. Other questions? Yeah. Yes. Which is really interesting, which is meant to be a teaching moment for us. The idea is that Jesus is in a dialogue with the tradition as explained in the Old Testament. He cites it every other line, in some cases to counter his tormentors, not his tormentors, his opponents. I guess they are tormentors, the authorities. He quotes back Scripture to them and says, you're misinterpreting it. Here, he quotes back Scripture as a means of describing why he remains faithful. which is an example to us to sort of say, okay, what are the two most important things that we can do? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. And his response is an effort to underscore that by appealing to the Ten Commandments, by appealing to the first three commandments to say, I can't worship you because if I do, I will be violating those. So it is in effect a sermon, and the tempter figure, back to Drake's question, the tempter figure allows that to be, the tempter figure is in a sense a foil in the text that allows Jesus to do that. But he also, in a sense, represents, he represents the direction you could go and Jesus could go but decides not to, and does so through agency in deciding not to. I don't know if that answers your question. Yeah, there was another hand up. Go ahead. That's a good question. In some cases, yes. For instance, if you come back to this, the Wisdom of Solomon, the idea here is that each of us has an immortal soul, okay? And we can choose to live into that by worshiping God, keeping the commandments, and then our soul will live on forever because we will, in a sense, cheat death. And that by virtue of the way we live, our righteousness is immortal in this idea. And Paul has this too. Paul very much owes his understanding of eternal life and the immortal soul to some of the ideas in Greek thought, especially those of Plato. And so the idea of the immortal soul that will live on forever is very much owes to Greek thought. These other passages, especially the ones about light and darkness, good and evil, the dualism stuff that we have in. Has anybody ever heard of Zoroastrianism? This was the Iranian religion, the Persian religion, and it seems that Judaism was influenced by that. The whole notion in John of light, darkness, good, evil, and sort of the world is split into that is very much owing to Zoroastrianism, and that seems to have influenced the early believers as well. So there were ideas and the idea of angels of light, angels of darkness very much owes to Zoroastrianism. So these external ideas did influence the biblical writers and their understandings of who the devil was and how evil entered into the world. It's a really good question. I know we got to stop. We better stop now, huh? Yeah. All right, so next week we'll continue this. This was kind of a technical day. I know. This was a technical day. So next week, I want you to think about, and next week we're going to maybe look at some movie clips and I don't know that it will be lighter because we're talking about hell. I want you to think about what are your thoughts on hell, evil, Satan, and hell, and what did you grow up thinking? What do you think today? And do you think it exists? And what's its relationship to evil and what we've talked about today? So really light fare this February. Really always enjoy being with you though.